The train screeched to a halt under a low gray sky, dust rising in clouds from the gravel track as the German prisoners of war stepped cautiously onto Canadian soil. Faces hardened by war scanned the foreign landscape, then froze. Across the dusty clearing, not far from the small settlement, figures emerged, their features strikingly familiar. Could these really be their cousins, scattered thousands of miles away in this vast, unknown land? The chilling question hung in the air, heavy with suspicion and hope, before the first cautious words could be exchanged. The year was 1942, and the world was burning. But here, in the quiet backwoods of Ontario, the only smoke in the air came from the wood stoves of the Clem family farm. Heinrich Clem wiped the sweat from his brow with a calloused hand, squinting against the sun as he looked out over the golden waves of wheat. He had arrived in Canada in 1928, a young man seeking escape from the economic ruin of the Weimar Republic. He had found land, he had found a wife, and he had found a peace that the old country seemed to have forgotten. His son, Elias, was barely 12, but he knew the land like the back of his hand. "Father," Elias called out, pointing toward the horizon. "A train, not the usual one, stopped at the old crossing." Heinrich shielded his eyes. The rail line was rarely used, save for the occasional shipment of lumber or grain. To see it stop mid-morning was unusual. "Stay here, Elias. Watch the fence line. I will go see." Heinrich trudged through the tall grass, the dust of the road coating his boots. As he drew nearer to the crossing, the scene unfolded with a surreal distinctness. It was a military transport, unmarked but clearly government issue. From the side doors, men were being herded out. They wore uniforms, but they were not the khaki of the British or the olive drab of the Americans. They were field gray, the unmistakable gray of the Wehrmacht. Heinrich stopped dead in his tracks, his heart hammered against his ribs. Prisoners. German prisoners. He stood hidden behind a thicket of birch trees, watching the guards bark orders. The prisoners looked exhausted, their faces gaunt, their eyes shifting with the wariness of hunted animals. They were young, mostly, younger than Heinrich had been when he left, and then a voice drifted across the clearing. It was the voice of the German sergeant barking an order to line up. The accent. It was thick, guttural, Lower Saxon, the same dialect that Heinrich's father used to speak. One of the prisoners, a young man with a sharp jawline and eyes the color of the Baltic Sea, turned his head. He was looking toward the small cluster of houses that made up the settlement. He was looking directly at the small figure of Elias, who had disobeyed and crept closer. The prisoner froze. He saw the boy, but more than that, he saw the features. The high cheekbones, the deep-set eyes. He saw a mirror of his own family back in Schleswig-Holstein. The air grew thick with the unspoken. The prisoner took a hesitant step forward. A guard shoved him back. "Halt! Keep moving!" But the connection had been made. The prisoner's gaze locked onto Heinrich, who had stepped out from the trees. It wasn't fear in the young man's eyes. It was recognition, a terrifying, impossible recognition. "Uncle?" the prisoner whispered, the word carried by the wind. Heinrich felt the world tilt. He had left no family behind. He had thought he was alone. Yet, looking at this boy, he saw the ghost of his own brother, long dead in the Great War. The train whistle blew, a sharp, deafening shriek that shattered the moment. The guards moved faster, herding the prisoners toward the waiting trucks, but the eyes remained locked. The question remained unanswered. The dust settled, leaving Heinrich and Elias standing alone on the road. The train departed, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than before. father," Elias said softly. "Who was that?" Heinrich looked at his son, then back at the empty tracks. "I do not know, Elias. God help us, I do not know." Back at the prisoner of war camp, designated Camp 22, it was a world of barbed wire and rough timber. The prisoners were assigned barracks, given blankets that smelled of mothballs and despair, and instructed on the rules of their captivity. For most, it was a reprieve from the front lines. For Klaus Richter, it was a prison of the mind, edge of his cot, staring at the gray wall. He had not spoken a word since the arrival. The encounter at the tracks had shaken him to his core. The man he had seen. He looked exactly like his father's brother, Heinrich, the brother who had vanished after the Great War. The family legend said he had gone to America to seek his fortune and never return. But to see him here, in the wilds of Canada, with a boy who looked just like Klaus had at that age, it was impossible. "You are quiet, Klaus," said a voice beside him. It was Oberleutnant Dietrich, a man of sharp angles and colder logic. "The Canadian air does not agree with you?" Klaus looked up. "I saw something, Herr Oberleutnant, at the station." "You saw the Canadians, their rustic attempt at a military." The train screeched to a halt under a low gray sky, dust rising in clouds from the gravel track as the German prisoners of war stepped cautiously onto Canadian soil. Faces hardened by war scanned the foreign landscape, then froze. Across the dusty clearing, not far from the small settlement, figures emerged, their features strikingly familiar. Could these really be their cousins, scattered thousands of miles away in this vast, unknown land? The chilling question hung in the air, heavy with suspicion and hope, before the first cautious words could be exchanged. The year was 1942, and the world was burning. But here, in the quiet backwoods of Ontario, the only smoke in the air came from the wood stoves of the Clem family farm. Heinrich Clem wiped the sweat from his brow with a calloused hand, squinting against the sun as he looked out over the golden waves of wheat. He had arrived in Canada in 1928, a young man seeking escape from the economic ruin of the Weimar Republic. He had found land, he had found a wife, and he had found a peace that the old country seemed to have forgotten. His son, Elias, was barely 12, but he knew the land like the back of his hand. "Father," Elias called out, pointing toward the horizon. "A train! Not the usual one, stopped at the old crossing." Heinrich shielded his eyes. The rail line was rarely used, save for the occasional shipment of lumber or grain. To see it stop mid-morning was unusual. "Stay here, Elias. Watch the fence line. I will go see." Heinrich trudged through the tall grass. As he drew nearer to the dust of the road, the scene unfolded with a surreal distinctness. It was a military transport, unmarked but clearly government issue. From the side doors, men were being herded out. They wore uniforms, but they were not the khaki of the British or the olive drab of the Americans. They were field gray, the unmistakable gray of the Wehrmacht. Heinrich stopped dead in his tracks. His heart hammered against his ribs. Prisoners, German prisoners. Here, he stood hidden behind a thicket of birch trees, watching the guards bark orders. The prisoners looked exhausted, their faces gaunt, their eyes shifting with the wariness of hunted animals. They were young, mostly, younger than Heinrich had been when he left. And then, a voice drifted across the clearing. It was the voice of the German sergeant barking an order to line up. The accent. It was thick, guttural, Lower Saxon, the same dialect that Heinrich's father used to speak. One of the prisoners, a young man with a sharp jawline and eyes the color of the Baltic Sea, turned his head. He was looking toward the small cluster of houses that made up the settlement. He was looking directly at the small figure of Elias, who had disobeyed and crept closer. The prisoner froze. He saw the boy, but more than that, he saw the features. The high cheekbones, the deep-set eyes. He saw a mirror of his own family back in Schleswig-Holstein. The air grew thick with the unspoken. The prisoner took a hesitant step forward. A guard shoved him back. "Halt! Keep moving!" But the connection had been made. The prisoner's gaze locked onto Heinrich, who had stepped out from the trees. It wasn't fear in the young man's eyes. It was recognition, a terrifying, impossible recognition. "Uncle," the prisoner whispered, the word carried by the wind. Heinrich felt the world tilt. He had left no family behind. He had thought he was alone. Yet, looking at this boy, he saw the ghost of his own brother, long dead in the Great War. The train whistle blew, a sharp, deafening shriek that shattered the moment. The guards moved faster, herding the prisoners toward the waiting trucks, but the eyes remained locked. The question remained unanswered. The dust settled, leaving Heinrich and Elias standing alone on the road. The train departed, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than before. "Father," Elias said softly. Heinrich looked at his son, then back at the empty tracks. "I do not know, Elias. God help us, I do not know." Back at the prisoner of war camp, designated Camp 22, it was a world of barbed wire and rough timber. The prisoners were assigned barracks, given blankets that smelled of mothballs and despair, and instructed on the rules of their captivity. For most, it was a reprieve from the front lines. For Klaus Richter, it was a prison of the mind. Klaus sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the gray wall. He had not spoken a word since the arrival. The encounter at the tracks had shaken him to his core. The man he had seen, he looked exactly like his father's brother, Heinrich, the brother who had vanished after the Great War. The family legend said he had gone to America to seek his fortune and never return. But to see him here, in the wilds of Canada, with a boy who looked just like Klaus had at that age, it was impossible. "You are quiet, Klaus," said a voice beside him. It was Oberleutnant Dietrich, a man of sharp angles and colder logic. "The Canadian air does not agree with you?" Klaus looked up. "I saw something, Herr Oberleutnant, at the station." "You saw the Canadians, their rustic attempt at a military." "No," Klaus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw a family." Dietrich raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "Family? These Canadians are descendants of farmers and criminals. They have nothing in common with us." But Klaus shook his head, his hands trembling slightly. "The man in the trees, he had my uncle's face. Heinrich Richter. He disappeared in 1919. My father spoke of him until the day he died. He said Heinrich left for the New World, that he abandoned them. But I swear, it was him." Dietrich's expression shifted from skepticism to something more calculating. He glanced around the barracks to ensure no one else was listening. "You understand what you're suggesting, Richter? That there are Germans here settled in this wilderness while we rot in this camp? This is dangerous talk." "I need to know," Klaus insisted, standing now. "I need to speak with him." "And how do you propose to do that?" "We are prisoners. We are allowed to work, yes, but under guard. We cannot simply wander into town looking for long-lost relatives." Klaus's mind raced. The farms. They need workers. The Canadians are short-handed with their own men at war. We could be assigned to labor details. It's possible. Dietrich was silent for a long moment, studying Klaus with those piercing eyes. Finally, he spoke in a lower voice. "I will see what I can arrange, but you must be careful, Richter. The wrong word, the wrong look, and you could bring trouble not just on yourself, but on all of us. Remember, we are the enemy here." 2 days later, a list was posted on the camp bulletin board. Labor assignments. Klaus's name was there, assigned to farm work, Sector 7. The Clem farm was in Sector 7. Heinrich, meanwhile, returned home in a daze. At dinner, his wife, Marta, noticed his distraction. She was a practical woman born in Canada to German immigrant parents, and she missed nothing. "Heinrich," she said, setting down her spoon, "you've been staring at your plate for 10 minutes. What happened at the tracks?" Elias opened his mouth to speak, but Heinrich cut him off with a look. "Military business," he said gruffly. "Nothing to concern you." But Marta knew her husband. She saw the turmoil in his eyes. "You saw someone," she said quietly. "Someone from the old country." Heinrich's fork clattered against his plate. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You've been talking in your sleep again," Marta continued gently. "You haven't done that since your father passed. Whatever you saw, it's shaken you deeply." Later that night, Heinrich sat alone on his porch, watching the stars emerge over the dark fields. He pulled out a small wooden box from his coat pocket. Inside were yellowed photographs, letters he'd never sent, and a lock of hair from a brother he thought he'd never see again. Matthias, his younger brother who had stayed behind when Heinrich left. Matthias, who had fought in the war and died at Verdun, or so the family had believed. But if Matthias had survived, if he had children, the boy at the tracks could be his grandson. The timing would be right. The family resemblance, undeniable. The following morning brought a knock at the door. It was the local Canadian official, a man named Henderson, who coordinated prisoner labor assignments. "Morning, Clem," Henderson said, tipping his hat. "Got some news for you. The camp is offering work crews for harvest, prisoner labor. Your farm was selected. 3 men, starting tomorrow. Need the extra hands?" Heinrich's blood ran cold. "Prisoners, here, on my land?" Henderson nodded, oblivious to the tension. "Standard rates. They're just farm boys, mostly. Won't be any trouble. Better than letting the wheat rot, eh?" Heinrich wanted to refuse, to slam the door, but he couldn't. The harvest was critical. Without help, they'd lose half their crop to early frost. Fine. The next day dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn morning that promised a perfect harvest. Heinrich and Elias were in the barn when the truck arrived. 3 German prisoners, flanked by a Canadian guard, jumped down from the flatbed. They were dressed in work clothes, their uniforms confiscated, their heads shaved close. Heinrich's breath caught in his throat. The 3rd prisoner, bringing up the rear, was the young man from the crossing, Klaus. Their eyes met across the dusty barnyard. The recognition was instant and overwhelming. Klaus's face paled, and he took an involuntary step forward before the guard's voice stopped him. "All right, boys," the guard called out. "This is Mr. Clem. You'll do what he says when he says it. No funny business. Get to work." The other 2 prisoners, Hans and Otto, moved toward the grain silos, but Klaus remained frozen, staring at Heinrich. "You," Klaus whispered in German. "You are Heinrich Richter." Heinrich's world narrowed to this single moment. The years fell away. He was young again, standing with his brother Matthias in their father's field. He saw his brother's eyes in this boy's face. "I am Heinrich Clem," he said carefully, though his voice betrayed him, cracking with emotion. "This is Canada. You will speak English here." But Klaus stepped closer, ignoring the guard who was now watching with suspicion. "My father was Klaus Richter. He said you were the lucky one who escaped every Sunday. He said you would have come back for us if you could." The words struck Heinrich like physical blows. His brother had named his son after him, had waited for him. "Matthias," Heinrich breathed. "Your father, he is alive?" Klaus's expression darkened. "He died 2 years ago, in the bombing of Hamburg. But before he died, he made me promise. If I ever found you, to tell you, Elias, he never blamed you. Watching from the hayloft, he understood why you left slowly. "Father?" What's happening? Heinrich looked at his son, then at Klaus, and he realized he was standing between two worlds, two histories colliding. On one side, the life he had built in peace. On the other, the family and homeland he had left behind, now arriving in the form of prisoners at his doorstep. The Canadian guard, uncomfortable with the German conversation, stepped between them. "That's enough chit-chat. Get to work, prisoner." But Klaus didn't move. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a folded, worn photograph. He held it out to Heinrich. "He kept this," Klaus said. "All these years. It's of the two of you, before you left." Heinrich's hand shook as he took the photograph. There they were, two young men in their 20s, arms around each other's shoulders, standing in front of a thatched farmhouse. He looked so much like Klaus that it hurt. Matthias had kept his promise. He had never forgotten. "I have to know," Heinrich said, his voice thick. "How did you end up here? How did you become this?" Klaus's jaw tightened. "I was a teacher in Kiel. They came for me in 40, said it was my duty. I didn't want to fight. I never wanted any of this. We surrendered at Dieppe. They sent us here." Heinrich looked at the boy, no, the man, before him. Not an enemy soldier, but a nephew who had been forced into a war, captured, and now stood in his barn, asking for acknowledgement. The guard's patience snapped. "I said, get to work. Richter, you're on tractor duty with the boy. Move." Elias looked at his father for permission. Heinrich nodded slowly. "Go with him, Elias. Show him the Massey Harris. But be careful what you say." As father and nephew stood alone in the barn, the silence stretched between them like a bridge over a chasm. "You have a son," Klaus said finally, looking at Elias's retreating back. "He looks like you. Like my brother would have looked if he'd lived." Heinrich nodded, unable to trust his voice. "What happens now?" Klaus asked. Heinrich looked out at the fields, at the wheat that needed harvesting, at the sky that was already turning with the threat of weather. "Now," he said, "you work, we harvest, and we see what God has planned for us." But as they moved to join the others, a truck appeared on the distant road, raising its own cloud of dust. A military truck, this time flying a German flag. The impossible was about to become even more complicated. A German officer stepped out, flanked by two guards. He was older, his uniform immaculate, his demeanor that of a man used to command. "I am Major Vogel, German liaison to the Canadian government," he announced in crisp English. "I understand you have prisoners working here. I am here to conduct an inspection." Heinrich's heart sank. A German officer at his farm. The situation had just become infinitely more dangerous. Major Vogel's eyes swept over the scene, lingering on Klaus. "Richter," he said in German, "I see you found yourself comfortable work." Then his gaze turned to Heinrich. For a moment, confusion flickered across the major's face. He looked from Heinrich to Klaus, then back again. "Mein Gott," he breathed. Heinrich met the officer's gaze. The name, Vogel. The memory hit him like lightning. Fritz Vogel, his brother's best friend from the old village, someone who had always been at their table, always part of their circle. "Fritz," Heinrich said in German, the name slipping out before he could stop it. The major's composure cracked. He took a step back, his hand going to his sidearm. "Heinrich? Heinrich Richter? But you're dead. The family said you died in the 20s. Confused, moving between them. "Sir? Is there a problem?" Major Vogel ignored him, his eyes locked on Heinrich. "They held a funeral for you. Your father refused to speak your name after you left. He said you were dead to him." "I left to survive," Heinrich said, his voice hardening. "To escape the madness that was coming. Looks like I was right." Vogel's expression was a storm of emotions, shock, anger, and something that looked almost like shame. The things we had to do. You don't understand. The choices. After you left, everything changed. The party came, the promises. We all made compromises. And now you're here, Heinrich said, gesturing at the uniform, the medals, inspecting prisoners, serving the war, while your own village burns. The words hung in the air, sharp as barbed wire. Klaus watched in stunned silence. The two men who represented his entire world, his lost uncle and his commander, Vogel's face facing hardened. Each other across a barn. You have no right to judge. You ran away. We stayed. We fought. We served. And now, I will do my duty. He turned to the guard. These prisoners are to be returned to camp immediately. Their assignment here is terminated. But, sir, the guard protested, the harvest. I don't care about their harvest, Vogel snapped. These men are prisoners of war, not farmhands. Take them back. As the prisoners were loaded back onto the truck, Klaus looked back. In his eyes, Heinrich saw desperation. They had just found each other, and now they were being torn apart again. Heinrich made a decision. He stepped forward, ignoring the guard's warnings. Major Vogel, he called out. A moment, man to man. Vogel hesitated, then walked a few paces away from the others. What? Heinrich spoke in low, urgent German. The boy is family. My brother's son. I don't care about your politics or your war, but I will not let family be lost twice. You have no family here, Vogel hissed. You made your choice. Did I? Or did I just survive the same storm that killed Matthias? You think I don't see it in your eyes? The doubt? The guilt? You know this war is lost. You know what they're doing, and still you serve. Vogel's hand trembled slightly. You don't understand the position we're in, the pressure, the consequences. I understand that you can help, Heinrich pressed. You have access, ways, letters, and risk everything. You're a liaison. My career, my life, your soul, Heinrich whispered. What about that? For a long moment, Vogel stared at him. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his truck. But as he climbed in, he paused. The labor detail will continue, he said loudly enough for all to hear, but under strict supervision. Report to this farm tomorrow, same time. And Richter, you will be assigned here permanently. As the trucks drove away, leaving dust and unanswered questions, Klaus managed one last look back. His eyes met Heinrich's, and in that instant, a silent pact was made. They would not let this be the end. That evening, as Heinrich sat with his family, the weight of the day settled on his shoulders. Marta had heard everything from the neighbors who came running. She knew now what her husband had been hiding. They'll be back tomorrow, Elias said excitedly. Klaus said he knows how to fix the tractor's carburetor. Heinrich looked at his son. You like him? He's family, isn't he? Elias asked innocently. The question hung in the air. Heinrich looked at Marta, who nodded slowly. Yes, Elias, he's family. And family helps each other, no matter what uniform they wear or what flag they fight under. Outside, the wind blew across the fields, carrying with it whispers of old countries and new beginnings. The war raged on in Europe, but here, in this small corner of Canada, a different kind of battle was beginning. The battle for understanding, for forgiveness, for the bonds of blood that even war could not completely sever. The next day would bring more prisoners, more guards, more danger. But it would also bring the chance to know a nephew he never knew he had, to learn what had become of the family he left behind. And perhaps to find a measure of redemption for the choices he'd made so long ago. In the years that followed, this strange arrangement would become legendary in the small community. The German prisoners working the Canadian fields, the officer who looked the other way, the settler family who treated them not as enemies, but as kin. Letters would be smuggled, Stories would be shared across the barbed wire. And when the war finally ended, some of those prisoners would return, not to Germany, but to Canada, to stay. But that is a story for another time. For now, as the sun set on the Clem farm, 3 generations of one family, divided by war, united by blood, prepared for whatever tomorrow might bring. And in a world gone mad, they had found something rare and precious, a piece of home, in the most unlikely of places. Heinrich adjusted his glasses as he peered through the dim light of his father's study. The leather-bound books lining the walls seemed to hold their breath as he spread the smuggled letters across the mahogany desk. Each paper bore the cramped handwriting of soldiers from his old unit, men now scattered across the Eastern Front. "They write about the cold," Heinrich whispered, his voice raw. "About the mud that swallows men whole, and about the hope that dies a little more each day." Klaus, his younger brother by 3 years, leaned forward, his face illuminated by the single candle between them. The war had stolen his youth, etching premature lines around his eyes. "And you want to help them, even after what they did to Father's shop?" The memory of the confiscation stung anew. Uniformed men had emptied their family business in a single morning, labeling it non-essential and redistributing its assets. Yet Heinrich saw the distinction clearly now. Those are still men, Klaus. Men who freeze and starve and bleed. Men who wrote to me when I was their officer. I cannot simply let them become numbers on a casualty report. The floorboards creaked as footsteps approached. Both brothers froze, hearts pounding. The door handle turned. "Heinrich? Klaus?" It was their mother's voice, soft with exhaustion. "The Major is here." Major Vogel entered without waiting for permission. His uniform, pressed to a perfect crease, seemed to absorb what little warmth the room contained. He studied the brothers with eyes that had seen too much, then glanced at the letters before Heinrich could conceal them. "Traitorous correspondence," Vogel stated flatly, not as a question, but as a verdict. "I had hoped your family learned its lesson after the shop." Heinrich stood, positioning himself between the Major and his brother. "These are letters from soldiers, men who are suffering, men who need comfort from home. They need discipline. They need victory. They need to stop reading defeatist nonsense." Vogel's hand rested on his sidearm. "Give them to me, now!" Klaus's chair scraped back. "No." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Vogel's expression hardened, but Heinrich saw something else behind the steel. Weariness, perhaps, or doubt. "Step aside, boy," Vogel warned. "They're my letters," Heinrich said, finding a strength he didn't know he possessed. "My responsibility. If you must arrest someone, let it be me. But these words, they're all those men have left of their humanity." Vogel's silence stretched. The candle flame danced, casting long shadows across faces that had become strangers to one another. Finally, the Major's hand moved from his weapon. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice lower, "I will return with orders. Until then, but know this. Compassion is a luxury we cannot afford in war." He turned and left, his boots heavy on the stairs. The brothers looked at each other, breathing again. That evening, over watery soup and black bread, their mother spoke quietly. "The Major lost his son last month, in Russia. Perhaps he understands more than he lets on." In the years that followed, when the war had exhausted itself into silence and the cities lay in broken pieces, not as the letters were remembered, but as threads that held together the fraying fabric of human dignity. Heinrich never saw Major Vogel again, but he often wondered if the man who'd come to arrest him had instead chosen to look away. a small, secret act of rebellion that cost nothing and meant everything. XT. Farm. Day. The sun rises over the Canadian prairie. Heinrich, 50s, German settler, watches
Major
a military
Vogel,
truck
50s,
approach. German liaison.
This is the daily
Steps
pickup.
out, clipboard in hand. He avoids Heinrich's eyes. Vogel, morning, Heinrich. Prisoner Richter is assigned today. Farm work. Heinrich nods. I appreciate the arrangement, Major. INT Barn. Day Klaus, 20s, German POW, Heinrich's nephew, milks a cow with practiced hands. He still wears the POW armband, but his shirt is cleaner than the others. Klaus. The tractor engine needs work. I can fix it. He always said
Heinrich.
You had the touch. Your father would be proud. Klaus freezes. He hasn't heard his father mentioned with kindness in years. XT Field. Later, Heinrich and Klaus work on the tractor. Vogel stands nearby, ostensibly supervising, but actually blocking other guards from getting too close. Klaus, quietly. The others. They think I'm getting special treatment. Heinrich. You are, but not for the reasons they think. He pulls a worn photograph from his pocket. Two
Heinrich.
young men, brothers,
This is your
arms
father.
around each other. My brother Matthias. He died refusing to join them. Klaus takes the photo with trembling hands. Klaus' mother said you left because you were a coward. Heinrich. I left because someone had to survive to tell our story. Matthias understood that. Vogel clears his throat, moving closer. Vogel, into radio for show. Everything normal here. Prisoner working. Quietly, to them. Keep talking. I'll make sure the others don't hear. The other prisoners board. Klaus hesitates. The truck is loaded. Vogel steps up to Heinrich. Vogel, there's a program, compassionate transfers, for prisoners with family here. Heinrich, is that possible? Vogel, bitter smile. I lost my son at Stalingrad. I filed the paperwork. It will take time. But yes, it's possible. Heinrich looks at Klaus, standing by the truck. Heinrich. How long? Vogel war won't last forever. Then, he looks back at his family, at the farm, he stays, at the life he might one day
Klaus
have. Climbs into the truck. A farmhouse. Night. Heinrich places the photo of his brother on the mantel. Marta sets an extra plate. Marta, he'll be back? Heinrich. Yes, and next time, he'll stay. Ext farm. 1 year later. Day. A different truck arrives. Klaus steps out wearing civilian clothes, carrying a small bag. No armband. Heinrich waits at the gate. Behind him, Elias runs forward. Elias Klaus! You're staying! Klaus hugs the boy, then looks at Heinrich. Klaus Mayer Vogel made it happen. He retired from the army. Said he'd had enough. Heinrich extends his hand. Klaus pulls him into an embrace instead. Klaus danke, Onkel. Heinrich. Willkommen zu Hause, Neffe. Vogel appears from the truck cab, now in civilian clothes. He tosses his old cap onto the seat. Vogel. The war is still raging, but I'm done with it. If the offer still stands, I'd like to retire somewhere quiet. Heinrich. We have room at the table. For family. EXT. Farmhouse. Sunset. 4 people at dinner. Heinrich, Marta, Klaus, and Vogel. Elias brings the photo from the mantel. Elias. Tell me again about the brothers, before the war. Klaus takes the photo. Klaus, they chose each other, over everything else. Vogel, raising his glass, to choosing family. They drink. The camera pulls back, showing the warm light of the farmhouse against the vast Canadian sky. A new family, built in the ruins of the old one. Fade out, fade in. Exterior Canadian prairie. Day, the vast expanse of golden wheat fields stretches to the horizon. Barbed wire fences enclose a compound of simple wooden barracks. This is a prisoner of war camp in rural Alberta, 1943. EXT. Barbed wire fence. Continuous Klaus, 25, thin but strong, stares through the fence at the endless prairie. Nearby, his uniform is worn but clean. 30. His eyes from the black forest, weariness, tends a small vegetable garden the prisoners have cultivated in the compound. Herbert, calling out, "Klaus! Stop daydreaming and help me with these potatoes. They're the only good thing in this God-forsaken place." Klaus, quietly, "It's not God-forsaken, Herbert. It's just empty, different from the fatherland." Herbert, laughing bitterly, "The fatherland? That's a laugh. We're fighting for Hitler's delusions while our families ensuring starve." No guards are nearby. "Klaus, keep your voice down. You want solitary again?" Herbert sighs, wiping dirt from his hands. "Herbert, what does it matter? We're prisoners either way. At least here we can breathe." A Canadian guard, Corporal Davies, 40, approaches the fence. He carries a clipboard and a friendly expression despite the circumstances. Corporal Davies, "Morning, boys. How's the garden coming along?" Herbert stands stiffly, uncertain how to respond. Klaus steps forward. "Klaus, morning, Corporal. The potatoes are growing well. Thank you for allowing us this." Davies nods, making notes on his clipboard. "Corporal Davies' command wants an update on the labor assignments. I know you boys are bored stiff. Need to keep busy, right?" Herbert, under his breath, "Bored is better than dead." Davies either doesn't hear or pretends not to. He looks past them toward a farmhouse in the distance where smoke rises from a chimney. Corporal Davies, "That's the Henderson place. Good people. Lost their boy at Dieppe last year." Klaus's expression tightens. The weight of that statement settles over them. "Klaus, I'm sorry to hear that, Corporal." Davies studies Klaus for a moment, his eyes searching. Corporal Davies, "You know, it's funny. Henderson's wife keeps asking if she can bring you boys some fresh bread. Says you're just kids far from home. I have to tell her it's against regulations." Herbert, with sudden interest, "She wants to bring us food?" Corporal Davies, "Don't get any ideas. But, well, the war's been going on long enough. Some of us around here are starting to wonder what we're really fighting for." Davies moves along the fence line before either prisoner can respond. Klaus watches him go, then turns back to the horizon. "Klaus, my sister wrote me letters. She said the cities are rubble, that we should have surrendered at Stalingrad." Herbert looks at Klaus with new concern. Herbert, "That's dangerous talk, Klaus." Klaus, softly, "We're already in a cage, Herbert. What more can they do to us?" The sound of an approaching truck interrupts them. A vehicle bounces down the dirt road toward the camp, filled with men in civilian clothes. German accents can be heard arguing loudly. Klaus and Herbert exchange confused looks. Herbert, "What's this?" Klaus, "New arrivals?" Or, the truck stops. These men pile out, older, herded by guards, wearing civilian clothes, some with Nazi party pins still visible on their collars. One man, Gunther, 55, catches Klaus's eye. He wears a suit and carries himself with aristocratic bearing. Gunther, in perfect English to a guard, "This is an outrage. I demand to speak with your commanding officer. I am a civilian, a businessman, not a prisoner of war." The guard shoves him roughly. Guard, "You're interned, mister, same as the rest." Klaus's eyes widen as he recognizes the insignia on Gunther's briefcase, the eagle and swastika of the Nazi regime. Klaus, to Herbert in German, "That's a party member, a real one." Herbert spits on the ground. Herbert, "The bastards who got us into this mess." The new prisoners are marched past Klaus and Herbert. Gunther notices their uniforms, military issue, not civilian. Gunther, sneering in German, "Well, well, soldiers of the Reich. Are you going to just stand there watching these Canadians humiliate your countrymen?" Herbert takes a step forward, but Klaus stops him. Klaus, quiet, firm, "We are not your countrymen. We are prisoners, just like you." Gunther's face reddens with anger. Gunther, "You insolent boy. I have connections. When the Führer hears of this treatment, Herbert, cutting him off. The Führer? He's the reason we're in this hell. He sent us to die in Russia while you fat cats sat in Berlin. A guard intervenes, pushing Gunther toward the new barracks. Guard, move! No fighting! Gunther glares back at Klaus and Herbert as he's led away. Gunther, you'll pay for that disrespect. Klaus watches them go, a dark expression on his face. Herbert, how? Klaus. This changes everything. Now we have two enemies, the Canadians outside the wire and the Nazis inside. EXT, mess hall. Night. Klaus and Herbert sit with other prisoners. The new arrivals occupy a corner table led by Gunther. An invisible line divides the room. Gunther stands, addressing the room in German. Gunther. Comrades, we must remain disciplined. The Reich will prevail. We must show these Canadians our strength. A younger prisoner, Friedrich, 19, raises his hand. We lost the war. My brother is dead. My mother writes that Hamburg is ashes. What Reich are you talking about? Gunther storms over to Friedrich. Gunther. Defeatist talk. You'll report for punishment. Klaus stands abruptly. Klaus. There will be no punishments here. This isn't Germany, this is Canada. The room falls silent. The two groups stare at each other, the party loyalists versus the disillusioned soldiers. Gunther points a finger at Klaus. You're a traitor! Klaus, stepping forward. No, I'm a survivor, and I've learned that loyalty to a madman is a death sentence. The Canadians gave us life. What did the Reich give us? Murmurs spread through the room. Many of the soldiers nod in agreement. Herbert stands beside Klaus. Herbert, Klaus is right. I'm tired of dying for a lie. A guard enters, alerted by the noise. Guard. What's going on here? Klaus turns to the guard, learning to be speaking calmly, human again. Klaus. The guard eyes the tense room, just a discussion, then shrugs and leaves. Gunther stares at Klaus with pure hatred. Gunther. You'll regret this. Klaus meets his gaze without flinching. Klaus. I already regret many things. Adding you to the list won't matter. EXT barbed wire fence. Dawn, days later. Klaus stands by the fence again. In the distance, a woman approaches from the farmhouse. She carries a basket. It's Mrs. Henderson, 50s. She stops at the fence, the woman maintaining the required distance. Mrs. Henderson. Young man? Klaus straightens, surprised she's speaking to him. Klaus. Yes, ma'am? Mrs. Henderson. You're German, aren't you? Klaus. Yes, I am. She hesitates, then opens her basket. Inside is fresh bread wrapped in cloth. Mrs. Henderson. My son was your age. He wrote me letters about France. Said the people were kind. Klaus's throat tightens. Klaus. You fought in Russia, didn't you? I never fought in France. Klaus nods. Mrs. Henderson, looking down, sadly. No. Klaus? Yes, I was at Stalingrad. Mrs. Henderson unwraps a piece of bread and holds it out through the fence. Mrs. Henderson. I don't care where you fought. You're just a boy who ended up in the wrong place. Klaus hesitates, looking back at the barracks where Gunther and his faction watch. Klaus, I can't, ma'am. It would cause trouble. Mrs. Henderson. Then take it for your friend, the one who works in the garden, on the fence post, and steps back. Mrs. Henderson. We're not monsters, neither are you. She turns and walks away before Klaus can respond. He watches her go, then carefully retrieves the bread. He tears it in half. Behind him, Gunther's voice rings out. Gunther, traitor! Taking charity from the enemy! Klaus turns, holding both pieces of bread. He walks directly toward Gunther. Klaus, this isn't charity. This is humanity. Something you've forgotten. He extends one piece to Gunther. Klaus, take it or don't. But we are not the enemy anymore. The war is over for us. Gunther stares at the bread, then slaps it from Klaus's hand. Gunther, I will never accept weakness. Herbert appears beside Klaus, picks up the fallen bread, dusts it off. Herbert more for us then. He takes his half and eats it deliberately, staring at Gunther. Other prisoners begin to emerge from the barracks. One by one, they approach Klaus and Herbert. Friedrich. I'll take some, if there's extra. Another soldier steps forward, and another. Soon, a small line forms. Gunther stands alone, watching his influence crumble. Gunther. You're all traitors, every one of you. Klaus turns his back on Gunther, addressing the group. Klaus, no. We're survivors, and we're going home someday, to rebuild, not to conquer. The prisoners form a circle, sharing the bread Mrs. Henderson provided. Klaus, VO. Through the fence, the farmhouse light glows warm and yellow. The war had created enemies out of all of us, Canadians, Germans, soldiers, civilians, but here on this prairie, surrounded by wire and wheat, we were finding a way back to being people. XT, Canadian Prairie, sunset. Klaus, Herbert, and Friedrich stand at the fence, watching the sun set over the fields. Herbert. You think we'll ever go back? Klaus. Yes, but we won't be the same men who left. They stand in silence as the sky turns orange and purple. Fade out. The end Klaus continued to write every day, filling notebook after notebook with stories of hope and survival. Years later, his memoir would become required reading in schools, ensuring that future generations would never forget the horrors of war nor the resilience of the human spirit. XT. Berlin, Germany, 1960s. Day. A bustling street now in his 40s, the city shows signs of rebuilding, walks purposefully down the sidewalk remain visible. He carries a leather satchel and looks older, wiser. A young university student, 20, spots him and approaches excitedly. University student Herr Schmidt, your memoir, Wire and Wheat. It's required reading in my history class. What you wrote about the camp? Is it really true? Klaus stops, a gentle smile crossing his face. Klaus. Every word, young man, though sometimes even I have trouble believing it happened. University student. The part about the German settlers meeting the German prisoners, that was unbelievable. Did you ever see Mrs. Henderson again? Klaus's eyes drift to a distant memory. Klaus. Every Sunday for the rest of my time there. She brought bread, every week, until liberation came in 1945. The student pulls out a worn copy of the book. University student and Gunther? Last I heard, he went to a prison in Manitoba. Quietly. But that's not the important part. He was transferred. The important part is that Friedrich became my brother. Herbert and I opened a bakery together after the war. In Munich. We used Mrs. Henderson's recipe. He taps the book in the student's hands. Klaus. That's what we need to remember. Not the wire, not the uniform, but the bread. The humanity. XT. Munich Bakery, present day, day. The shop is warm, an elderly Klaus of fresh bread stands behind on the wall counter, hangs a framed photo, a young apprentice. Klaus, Herbert, and Friedrich at the fence in Alberta, 1944. Apprentice grandfather, why do you always make that special loaf on Sundays? Klaus carefully shapes dough, his hands practiced and gentle. Klaus, because, my boy, Sundays were when we remembered we were human. And that's the most important recipe of all. He looks up at the photo, his eyes misty. Klaus, VO, the fences disappeared. The wire was torn down. But the lessons learned in that prairie camp, that our enemies are often just reflections of our fears, and that kindness is a language all can understand, those lessons built a bridge that still stands today. Fade to black. Epilogue text on screen. Klaus Schmidt's memoir Wire and Wheat has been translated into 23 languages. His bakery in Munich still operates, run by his grandchildren. Every year, a package arrives from Canada, a small loaf of homemade bread from Mrs. Henderson's descendants, who still live on that Alberta farm. EXT. Alberta farmhouse. Present day. Day. A white farmhouse sits peacefully against the vast Canadian prairie sky. An older woman, Margaret Henderson, 70s, tends to a garden with careful hands. She straightens up as a car pulls into the gravel driveway. A young man, Daniel, 25,
Daniel,
steps
Grandma?
out, carrying a leather
Margaret
satchel. Shields her eyes from the sun, a smile spreading across her weathered face. Margaret, Daniel, you're early. The bread isn't quite ready. Daniel, that's fine. I wanted to ask you something before I head back to the university. He approaches the porch, where Margaret joins him, wiping her hands on her apron. Margaret, what is it, dear? Daniel, I've been reading Professor Schmidt's book for my literature course, the one you told me about.
Margaret's
expression softens,
Wire
her
and
eyes
wheat.
growing distant. Margaret Klaus. He was a good man. Daniel, the book says he was a prisoner here, during the war, that you brought him bread through the fence. Margaret, nodding slowly, every Sunday, just like my mother did before me, though she never told anyone, not even your grandfather until years later. She gestures to the wooden fence line, still visible at the edge of the property. Margaret, that fence divided more than land, loyalty from
Daniel.
humanity. Many folks around here saw them as the enemy. I just saw a boy who looked cold. Daniel, but they were soldiers, the enemy. Margaret, leaning against the porch railing, war makes enemies of us all. But hunger, pain, loneliness, those don't care about flags or uniforms. I learned that when I was barely older than you. She looks toward the horizon, remembering. Margaret, my son, your Uncle Michael. He was the same age as those boys in the camp. Told me about a German soldier who shared his rations with him when he was wounded. That German boy saved his life. Daniel, quietly. I never knew that. Margaret. The war took him anyway, 2 months later. But that kindness, that stayed with me. When I saw those boys behind wire working in our fields, I couldn't hate them. I could only see Michael's face. Daniel, Professor Schmidt writes about that, about how hate is easy, but understanding
Margaret,
takes smiling, sadly. Klaus understood. He and his friends, Herbert, Friedrich, they were just boys who'd been given guns and told the world was black and white. But here, on this prairie, they saw all the colors. She stands, brushing dust from her skirt. Margaret, come inside. I have something to show you. In T, farmhouse kitchen. Continuous. The kitchen is warm, filled with the smell of baking bread and old memories. Margaret pulls a wooden box from a high shelf, revealing letters tied with ribbon, photographs, and a small, worn notebook. Margaret, after Klaus was released, he wrote to me, every month, for years, even after he moved to Munich. She hands Daniel a photograph. It shows a young Klaus and Herbert, standing proudly outside a small bakery with a sign, Schmidt and Weber, brought aus Hoffmann's Rezept, bread from Hoffmann's recipe. Daniel, this is she unfolds a letter, written in careful German, with a translation paperclip and look to it. Margaret, Contied. Dear Mrs. Henderson, Herbert and I opened our bakery today. We used your recipe for the Sunday loaf. The first customer was a Jewish man who had lost everything. He tasted the bread and wept. He said it tasted like home. I told him it was a recipe from Canada, from a woman who taught me that enemies are just friends we haven't understood yet. Your kindness, Mrs. Henderson, built this bakery. Klaus. Daniel is silent, reading the letter. Daniel, Grandma. Did you ever see him again? Margaret, once. In 1963. He sent me a ticket. I flew to Munich. The bakery was busy, full of people. He stopped everything when he saw me. We sat in the back just like old friends. He introduced me to Herbert and Friedrich. They had families, children. They called me Mutter Henderson. Her eyes glisten. Margaret, Conti, beautiful children with blonde hair and blue eyes. He said, this is what we built instead of what we were told to destroy. Daniel. That's incredible. Margaret. He gave me that loaf of bread, the one from the photo on the wall. It tasted just like the bread I used to bring through the fence. He'd remembered. XT. Farmhouse. Later, Daniel stands by the old fence line, where the wire has long since been removed, leaving only wooden posts. Margaret joins him,
runs his
carrying
hand
a
over the
small
weathered
wrapped
wood.
loaf. Margaret, every year, on the anniversary of the day the camp was liberated, I bake 2 loaves. One for us, one I send to Munich. His grandchildren still write to me. They say Grandfather Klaus always gets emotional when the package arrives. She hands Daniel the loaf. Margaret, conted, "Take this back to your dorm. Share it with your roommates. Tell them the story. Stories like this. They're the real memorial. Not statues, not plaques. Just people remembering to be human." Daniel. "I will, Grandma. I promise." They stand together, watching the sun cast long shadows across the prairie. Margaret. "The wire is long gone. The soldiers are gone. But the bread still connects us. That's the lesson, Daniel. Always look for the bread." Int. University Lecture Hall. Day. Daniel stands before his classmates, holding the loaf. Daniel. He looks at his professor.
We study war
then
to
understand
notes.
what separates us.
His voice is
but
strong,
we should study peace
clear.
to understand what connects us. My grandmother's fence didn't divide enemies from allies. It divided fear from compassion, and in that space, something grew. He breaks the loaf, sharing it with those around him. Daniel, conted, something stronger than wire, more enduring than armies. A simple act of humanity that crossed continents, generations, and changed lives. The camera pulls back to show the entire class sharing the bread, talking, connecting. Klaus, VO. The fences we build are always temporary. The bridges we create through understanding. Those can last forever. In that Alberta camp, surrounded by wire and wheat, we learned that the true victory isn't in defeating your enemy, but in discovering you were never truly enemies at all. Fade to black. Final title card. In 1995, Klaus Schmidt and Margaret Henderson were both awarded the Order of Canada for their work in reconciliation education. The bakery in Munich still sends a special loaf to Alberta every Christmas. The fence is gone, but the friendship remains. End of continuation.